Yesterday, Politico published something that has never appeared in the history of the European Union. A senior EU diplomat, on record, said this: "If Orban wins, the gloves will be off." A second diplomat added, "Many believe that a red line was crossed with the blocking of a loan to Ukraine, and something needs to be done about it, but it is unclear what. It is unclear what." That sentence is the most important sentence in European politics right now. Because what it means is this: Brussels has a threat. Brussels does not have a plan. And the threat is being made 12 days before a democratic election inside the European Union. The gloves will be off, against a member state, for winning an election. This is not a leak from a disgruntled official. This is Politico. This is the EU's own aligned media, publishing the institutional position of the bloc toward one of its own members. And the position is, if you vote the wrong way on April 12th, the consequences will be severe. Here is what mainstream media will not put in the same frame. Let's go. Politico published 5 scenarios. 5 concrete options that EU diplomats are actively discussing for what happens if Orban wins. Not what happens if he breaks a law. Not what happens if he violates a treaty. What happens if his voters choose him again? Scenario 1. Qualified majority voting instead of unanimity for decisions in sensitive areas. Translation: remove the veto. The legal right every member state was given when they signed the treaties. Gone. By rewriting the rules while the election is still 12 days away. Scenario 2. Flexible formats. Informal coalitions of willing countries making decisions outside the full EU framework. Translation: build a parallel EU that excludes Hungary whenever Hungary disagrees. Brussels without Budapest. A union of 26 that operates as if the 27th does not exist. Scenario 3. More aggressive coercive measures, including withholding EU funds. Translation: the 22 billion already frozen is just the beginning. If Orban wins, that number goes up. The penalty payments continue. The defense credits stay blocked. And new mechanisms are activated to cut Hungary off from the European budget entirely. Scenario 4. Suspension of voting rights. This is Article 7. 7 years of discussion. Never activated. Always threatened. Now described in Politico as a realistic option. Not the most extreme one. Not the last resort, but a working scenario being actively prepared in Brussels 12 days before April 12th. Scenario 5. Expulsion from the European Union. The diplomats themselves called this the least realistic option. Their reason, and pay close attention to this, was not that it would be wrong, not that it would be illegal, not that it would violate any principle of democratic governance. Their reason was that expelling Hungary would push it into Russia's orbit. The only argument against expelling a member state for winning a democratic election is geopolitical inconvenience. Not principle, not law. Convenience. That is the European Union on March 30th, 2026. 12 days before the Hungarian people vote. Now let's be precise about what the red line actually is, because the diplomats named it. The red line is the blocking of the 90 billion euro loan to Ukraine. That is the specific act that crossed it. Not corruption. Not democratic backsliding. Not human rights violations. A financial vote. A legal veto. The exercise of a treaty right that every member state holds equally. Orban voted against 90 billion euros of joint EU debt, 60 billion of which is earmarked for weapons to be sent to Ukraine. That vote, cast legally through the established mechanism by a democratically elected government, is now being described as a red line that justifies expulsion from the bloc. And here's what makes this even more significant. The 90 billion package is not even primarily a humanitarian question. It is a weapons financing question. The EU wants to borrow 90 billion on joint European debt, meaning every member state shares the liability, and sends 60 billion of it to fund military operations. Hungary said no. And Brussels said that no is a red line. At what point does a member state's right to say no to joint military debt become grounds for expulsion? The answer, according to the Politico sources, is when enough other members decide it is. There is no treaty threshold. There is no legal standard. There is a diplomatic consensus that is forming in real time against one country 12 days before that country votes. Now let's connect this to everything that has happened in the last 3 weeks. Because the Politico piece did not appear in a vacuum. It is the latest step in a sequence that has been running since March 6th. March 6th. Hungary seizes $80 million in Ukrainian assets on a Hungarian highway. Cash and gold moving through Hungarian territory without notification to Hungarian authorities. March 16th. The EU activates the Rapid Response Mechanism under the Digital Services Act specifically for the Hungarian election. Funded fact-checkers and NGOs can now flag content for accelerated removal. The censorship infrastructure goes live before any of the content it will moderate has been published. March 22nd. The Washington Post publishes the wiretapping story. Anonymous intelligence sources claiming Hungary's foreign minister leaked EU secrets to Russia for years. No documents. No names. Anonymous officials. March 24th. A former Hungarian police officer claims Hungarian intelligence is sabotaging the Magyar campaign. 2 million YouTube views in days. March 26th. The EU freezes Hungary's 16 billion euro safe defense credit. Hungary is the only one of 19 applicants rejected. 18 approved. 1 blocked. Same day. Fico treason investigation opened in Slovakia. March 30th. Politico publishes the 5 scenarios. The gloves will be off. 12 days before April 12th. Now count the financial numbers, because the numbers are the story. 22 billion in EU cohesion funds frozen. 16 billion in defense credits blocked. 1 million euros per day in penalty payments. Over 500 days of accumulation. The EU court examining whether Hungary must repay 10.2 billion in previously disbursed funds. The Safe Program defense credit, 16 billion additional. The total financial pressure being applied to Hungary right now, from an institution that claims to be a union of equal member states, exceeds 50 billion euros, against a country whose entire annual GDP is approximately 200 billion. 1/4 of Hungary's economic output is being held hostage by Brussels. And what is the condition for releasing it? There is no formal condition publicly stated. There is no compliance checklist. There is a veto that Brussels wants reversed. And until it is reversed, the money stays frozen. Now let's look at what Orbán said yesterday in response to the Politico piece. He was in campaign mode, speaking at a rally in eastern Hungary. He addressed the 5 scenarios directly. He said, and this is a direct quote from his official communications, "They can try whatever they want. We have survived worse. Hungary will not be blackmailed." And then he added something that nobody in Western media reported. He said, "The EU is not threatening Hungary. The EU is threatening Hungarian voters. They are telling the Hungarian people, if you vote for Orbán, we will punish your country." That reframe is precise and it is accurate. The Politico scenarios are not directed at Orbán the person. They are directed at the electorate. Every Hungarian citizen who reads the Politico piece, or hears about the 5 scenarios, is receiving a message before they enter the voting booth. Your choice has consequences for your country's standing in Europe. That is not a neutral information environment. That is an institutional pressure campaign directed at an electorate 12 days before polling day. And the EU Commission, asked to respond to the Politico reporting, said, through a spokesperson, that the Commission does not comment on hypothetical scenarios. The Commission does not comment on hypothetical scenarios. But it did activate a censorship mechanism before the election. It did freeze the defense credit after the veto. It did allow the wiretapping story to circulate without demanding an investigation into who ran the operation. And it did allow its own diplomats to brief Politico on the 5 scenarios without any official pushback. Silence is also a message. And Brussels' silence on its own diplomat statements is the loudest signal yet. Now let's talk about what none of the 5 scenarios can actually achieve, because this is the part that the Politico piece buried in the final paragraphs. Scenario 1. Removing the veto through qualified majority voting requires unanimous treaty change. To remove unanimity, you need unanimity. Slovakia will not vote for it. Italy under Meloni has signaled resistance. Austria has expressed concerns. The legal path to ending the veto runs through the veto itself. Scenario 2. Flexible formats. Has already been tried. The bilateral Ukraine loan arrangement. The Plan B of 30 billion in bilateral credits from willing member states, the enhanced cooperation mechanism. Every workaround produces a smaller result at higher institutional cost. The EU tried to replace 90 billion with 30 billion and called it a solution. Scenario 3. More aggressive fund withholding. Has a limit. At some point, cutting EU funds to a member state produces exactly the Russia's orbit outcome that the expulsion scenario is designed to avoid. If Hungary receives nothing from Brussels, the nuclear deal with Washington and the energy relationship with Moscow become the only economic anchors available. Starving Hungary does not make it more European. It makes it more dependent on the alternatives it already has. Scenario 4. Article 7 voting rights suspension requires unanimity among all other member states. Slovakia will veto it. The mechanism cannot activate. Scenario 5. Expulsion. Has no legal basis in any EU treaty. There's no article, no procedure, no precedent. It would require a treaty amendment. That treaty amendment would require unanimity. Slovakia would veto it. Every scenario in the Politico piece runs into the same wall. The EU does not have the legal mechanism to do what its diplomats are threatening. The threats are real. The consequences are real. The financial pressure is real. But the ultimate sanctions, removing the veto, suspending voting rights, expelling the member, are legally impossible without the cooperation of the countries being threatened. This is the EU's fundamental problem. It has built an institution where the enforcement mechanisms require consensus, and the countries it most wants to enforce against are the ones withholding that consensus. Orbán understands this better than anyone in Brussels. He has understood it for 15 years. The veto is not just a policy tool. It is structural leverage that cannot be removed without his agreement, and he will never agree to remove it. Which is why the gloves coming off is not a strategy. It is a frustration, and frustration expressed 12 days before a democratic election by the institution whose neutrality is supposed to protect that election is the most important political story in Europe right now. Mainstream media is giving you the Politico headline, the 5 scenarios, the gloves off quote, each one labeled as news, each one presented as a development, each one missing the context that makes it significant. The context is this: an institution is threatening an electorate. A union of democratic states is warning its own citizens that their vote has a price. And the price is being named, publicly through aligned media, with diplomatic sources on record. 12 days before polling day. That is not how a democratic institution behaves toward its own members. That is how an institution behaves when it has run out of legitimate options, and is hoping that fear finishes what financial pressure could not. April 12th is 12 days away. The gloves are already off. They came off in March when the first scandal dropped. They came off when the defense credit was frozen. They came off when the censorship mechanism was activated before there was anything to censor. The Politico piece did not announce a new threat. It confirmed a position that has been in place for weeks. The difference is that now it is on the record. Now it is named. Now every Hungarian voter knows exactly what Brussels thinks their vote is worth. Subscribe. Because whatever happens on April 12th, the story that follows will be the biggest European political story of the decade. And you will want to understand it the moment it breaks. Not after the mainstream media has had 3 days to frame it. 12 days. Every vote counts. And Brussels is counting on the wrong thing.